Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. After a questionable invasion of Venezuela, an ill-advised war against Iran, is a military intervention in Cuba next on the agenda? That issue is next. Dr. Jorge Duany is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology in the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies at Florida International University. He's the author of over 20 books. His latest book is Cuba and Puerto Rico, Transdisciplinary Approaches to History, Literature, and Culture. Dr. Duany, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let me start off with this. Most people are aware of the tensions that occurred between the United States and the Castro regime, including the hijackings of the 1960s. But a lot of people are not aware that the obsession with Cuba goes back almost 200 years. From Thomas Jefferson, and I want to give you a quote of his, that I candidly confess that I have ever looked on Cuba as the most interesting addition which could ever be made to our system of states, unquote. Then you have the 1854 Ostend Manifesto. Then you have President Polk and President Pierce who tried to buy Cuba. Then you have the war in which they obtained Cuba, or Cuba is set free, rather. The question that I have for you is, why is the United States so obsessed with Cuba?
Well, as you say, the history goes back at least 200 years. In fact, before the U.S. became an independent country, there were very close commercial ties between Cuba and the United States, and that has to do greatly with the geographic proximity. Cuba, of course, is only 90 miles away from the U.S. mainland, and those commercial ties grew so strong that by the middle of the 19th century, Cuba was uh, exporting most of its sugar and its other primary products to the United States rather than its uh, mother country, Spain. So by the end of the 19th century, from an economic perspective, in fact, if not from a political perspective, Cuba depended very much on the United States. And I think that's what really uh, stimulated that appetite that you just reviewed from U.S. presidents and many policymakers to acquire or purchase or annex Cuba. Uh, Also, we should take into account that before slavery was abolished in the U.S., Cuba would have been an addition to a slave state. So many Southern politicians were interested in acquiring Cuba because of that matter. Uh, and so by the end of the 19th century, by the beginning of the 20th century, because of these commercial and geopolitical interests, Cuba was very much in the radar of many U.S. policymakers. And I should finalize by saying that also because of the growing strategic importance of the Straits of Florida and the Caribbean in general for the United States as the U.S. prepared to become a world power, Cuba was seen as indispensable to U.S. Naval interests as a coaling station and eventually as a naval station, which, as listeners may recall, is based in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. So that geopolitical and strategic interest became sort of the last straw in that very long sequence of connections between Cuba and the United States.
Now, after the war with Spain, Cuba is set free, but there's still some signs of tension between Cuba and the United States. And I want to read a quote from then President Theodore Roosevelt, who in 1905 said this, quote, Just at the moment, I am so angry with that infernal little Cuban republic that I would like to wipe its people off the face of the earth. All that we have wanted from them was that they would behave themselves and be prosperous and happy so that we would not have to interfere, unquote. So, I mean, the tensions go back and forth. They wanted it. Theodore Roosevelt is mad at them. My question is, why did the United States not simply annex Cuba as it did with the Philippines and with Puerto Rico?
The short answer to that is that before the United States intervened in the so-called Spanish-American War, which Cubans call the Spanish-Cuban-American War, or the Spanish-Cuban-Filipino War, because there was also conflict in that area of the world. The public opinion and Congress was very much divided into two camps. Those which supported the expansionist uh, impulses of the United States and wanted to acquire more land. Now, in this case, after having uh, uh, sort of consolidated its continental hegemony in overseas territories like the Caribbean or the Pacific, and that meant immediately Spanish possessions, former Spanish possessions. But also there was a very strong anti-imperialist uh, current, both in Congress and in general in public opinion in the United States. And that led to the infamous Platt Amendment, which was posed by Oliver Platt, congressman from Ohio, uh, around 1898, to make sure that if the United States intervened in the Spanish-American War, it would not occupy Cuba forever. In fact, it occupied Cuba for only 4 years from a military perspective, but would actually ensure after the independence of the island that the United States would have a very strong role if the United States saw its military, economic, and political interests threatened. And in fact, during those early years of the Infernal Republic, as Roosevelt liked to call it, the United States intervened, depending on your count, 3 or 4 times in order to appease different sections of the Cuban population and to be able to maintain a certain stability on the island.
Now, I want to give you a third quote because in 1928, uh, Calvin Coolidge goes there, and he was the last president to visit before Barack Obama did in 2015. And he says this quote, 30 years ago, Cuba ranked as a foreign possession, torn by revolution and devastated by hostile forces. Such government as existed rested on military force. Today, Cuba is her own sovereign. People are independent, free, and prosperous, peaceful, and enjoying the advantages of self government. Unquote. What is interesting about that, then not too long after that, Cuba had elected in a democratic fashion Gerardo Machado, who became a dictator in his second term. So there's always been kind of this to and fro with Cuba, um, democratically electing people, then they become dictators like Batista did later on. So how does Cuba reconcile that? It seems as though they want democracy, but the powers that be really don't value democracy.
Yeah, or some explanations of that historical problem can be taken back to the Spanish colonial period, in which, of course, uh, there was very little experience in democratic self-rule, unlike, for example, the 13 colonies of the United States or other parts of the world. And so Cuba became a republic very late on, after most Spanish American countries in the mainland had done so. So it had very little experience in governing itself. And in addition to that, then you have to add this dependence on the United States. Some people call it a neo-colonial relationship or a pseudo-republic because it was really not sovereign in a full sense, because again, it was always subject to U.S. intervention, which, as I just mentioned, happened several times in the first 30 years of the republic. So then, if you look back at the uh, very convoluted history of democracy in Cuba, you can only really find a very short period of time. Some people call it the golden age of Cuba's democracy between 1940 and 1952. Only 12 years, really, of more than 100 years of independence, in which democratically elected uh, governments were uh, succeeded each other, and in which most observers would agree there was a free and open competition of political parties. That all ended again with Batista's second time as a ruler, in which he overthrew the democratic elected president of Cuba in 1952, and then remained in power until 1958.
Now, when I moved to, let's say, the Castro years and the tension that was created there, Castro was recognized as the legitimate leader by Eisenhower before he began to announce himself as the Marxist Leninist. Um, in your opinion, why couldn't the United States just maintain that relationship regardless of what he considered himself to be? For example, we deal with Laos, we deal with Vietnam, neither of whom are democratic societies. Why could we not maintain that? The second part of that is even during his administration, even when tensions were at the highest, the United States still maintained backdoor conversations with him, from Henry Kissinger to David Rockefeller's daughter, who took a letter from Castro straight to George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan. So, why is the United States so against what Cuba wants to be? Because we do that with other nations.
Yeah, that's an interesting historical question. I think the immediate response would be that Cuba nationalized all U.S. properties and eventually all Cuban business initiatives as well in the 1960s. And those expropriations of large and not so large concerns led to the uh, growing tensions between the United States and Cuba. Uh, Initially, the Eisenhower administration in 1961 broke diplomatic relations, and those relations were not reinstated until 2015 under the Obama administration. So during those very long decades of enmity, uh, the United States and Cuba were forced to rely on these back channels. Some of them worked better than others. For example, in 1977, the Carter administration was able to reinstate what we then call interest sections, which were short of embassies, but at least there was some diplomatic contact between the two countries. But yeah, during a long period of time, the uh, the Cold War, especially until the fall of the Soviet Union, dominated this uh, conflicted relationship between the two countries that, again, were very close to each other geographically, but very opposed to each other politically.
Um, one question I want to ask you, and kind of which is a political question, the policy towards Cuba tends to coincide with how the population of Miami feels. It's 29 electoral votes. One, do you think that is appropriate? Because I remember when Barack Obama went to Cuba, the people of Cuba, by and large, supported that. Miami was split. So, what should gear the policy towards Cuba? Should it be the population of Miami, or should it be the population of Cuba?
Well, some observers would characterize the current situation as a triangular relationship. So it's Havana, Washington, and Miami, clearly because of the large number. It's the largest Cuban American community in the US and in the world. And so, because of the growing political um, power of Cubans in Miami, there are now three congressmen representing South Florida and a couple more from other places throughout the United States. And of course, there's Marco Rubio, who is the first Hispanic Secretary of State. And so they have a disproportionate influence on Washington's foreign policy, particularly toward Cuba. And we're seeing that now as we speak because of the uh, growing participation of Cuban exiles and their interest through the Marco Rubio's uh, uh, situation and influence on on President Trump. We have some people say that he really is the architect of
Mhm.
U.S. policy toward Cuba. However, at the same time, I think sometimes observers exaggerate the influence of Cuban Americans in Washington policy. For example, on the question of the Obama opening, it's interesting that during those years, 2014, 2015 in particular, the majority of Cubans in the US, particularly in South Florida, actually supported the opening, supported reestablishing diplomatic relations, supported even considering lifting the embargo, which never happened. But at least there seemed to be a willingness to consider other options. Now, on the question of the visit itself, there was, as you said, a lot of division in here in Miami. Some said that it was giving into soft power in Cuba, and particularly that scene that has been replayed over time, in which Obama sat next to Raul Castro, who was then president of Cuba, in a baseball game. So it was too cozy for many exiles and the descendants here in Miami. However, in general, I think during that time, the majority of Cubans in South Florida were willing to try it. Now, the pendulum has swung back to a hardline position now, and uh, and even recent polls have suggested that most Cuban Americans are willing to support a military invasion of Cuba, which has not happened, of course, since 1961.
Stay with that for a minute. In terms of a military invasion, um, one of the things that has happened is that the former president, although many feel that he's still the power behind the throne, Raul Castro, has been indicted. And many people say that this is actually a pretext for an invasion so that you can't call it a military invasion, but a law enforcement action. What's your take on that?
I think that's an accurate assessment. I think, of course, the Trump administration is using the Venezuelan playbook, which was very successful from a military perspective back in January, and clearly, uh, the one of the legal justifications for some sort of military strike in Cuba, if not a full-fledged invasion, would be precisely to capture Raúl Castro and bring him to justice in Miami. However, some analysts have suggested that's very unlikely to happen, uh, in part because of the age of Raul Castro, who just turned 95, his frail health, and also difficulties of actually extracting him from Cuba and bringing him to Miami. However, again, the Venezuelan example back in January seems to play a large role in this in the current chess game between Cuba and the United States, particularly the threat of military invasion, which President Trump has repeated several times since January, and also the movement of troops and assets in the Caribbean, along with increasing coercion and pressure, the maximum pressure that's been called by the Trump administration in order to force political and economic reforms in Cuba.
I want to talk about that in a little while, but one of the things that has happened in Cuba is the idea that the church can operate in Cuba. I mean, it used to be a policy of formal atheism, but that is no longer. But the Catholic Church and I believe Assemblies of God have great influence there. And Secretary Marco Rubio, when he was offering $100 million in humanitarian aid, wanted to do it through the Catholic Church and I believe Assemblies of God and other institutions as well. From what you understand, how is that happening? The Cuban government has said that it has accepted that. Um, Secretary Rubio says that they have not. Where do we stand with that right now?
I think first that the Catholic Church has historically been the only or the major non-state institution in Cuba since, especially after the 1970s and 80s, when, as you say, the Cuban government reassessed its position toward religion, And rather than being an atheist state, now it's a lay state that doesn't exclude uh, practitioners from the Communist Party, for example. And so the relations between the Vatican and the Cuban government have improved over time, especially with the visit of three popes, not just one, uh, Francis and Benedict in the past decades. And so even though the
Pope John.
John Paul, exactly, the first one. So even though the church does not have a major role in Cuba today, its laws, for example, its schools and many of its properties, uh, it has been able to survive a very difficult situation over time. And I think now it's positioned to play an intermediate role, perhaps, between Cuba and the U.S. And it has played so in several occasions. For example, in uh, uh, promoting the release of political prisoners uh, at different points in time. So, if you consider the most recent gesture by the U.S. to provide some humanitarian aid and channel it through the church and other uh, non-state institutions, I think it's worked pretty well. Uh, and both parties, both the Cuban government and the United States, seem to be happy with that.
I want to talk a little bit about the Cuban economy right now because the sanctions have obviously had a devastating effect on the economy of Cuba. But Cuba has a GDP of $140 billion. One of their biggest exports, I think, is medical personnel, but also surprising to me was nickel and cobalt, which I think has been sort of stopped right now through the American government because of what's going on in Canada in terms of a shutdown of one of the companies that Cuba was dealing with to refine their nickel and cobalt. So, how is Cuba surviving now financially? The other question is Secretary Rubio had said that GASA has about 18 billion dollars in cash. Now, there are some who say that that figure is not accurate. I think Emily Wilson from the University in London says the figure is actually closer to 700 million. So, from what you understand, who's right and what's going to happen with the economy going forward?
Yeah. First, the first question about how Cuba survived is actually a very difficult one to answer because its main sources of foreign exchange have been drastically curtailed in the past months. Uh, and if you consider, for example, that the main sources again were tourism, which has declined tremendously in the past couple of years. It's never recovered from the pandemic in 2020, 21. And that was a major source of income for the Cuban government and for the Cuban population. Uh, and the numbers that I have seen suggest that the decline will continue throughout the year, and again, will have very negative repercussions on the island. The second source, perhaps, was the export of medical services, and that too has been cut down as many countries pressured by the U.S. Throughout the world have decided to terminate their agreements with the Cuban government to provide doctors and other kinds of health personnel. And the third one has been in the past few years remittances, meaning the money that is sent by Cubans to their in the United States and around the world to their relatives. And the numbers suggest that the uh, the volume of those remittances have dropped from about $4 billion before the pandemic to about $1 billion now. Also, in addition to the money transfers, there's the transference of actual uh, uh, material items that people take with them when they travel to Cuba, and that's a little harder to estimate. And as you said, the fourth or fifth source is probably the export of minerals, which has also been curtailed. So the situation is pretty dire if you consider that uh, the primary sources of income in Cuba have decreased. Addition to that, of course, there's the oil embargo that the Trump administration has imposed since January, and the practical termination of Venezuelan oil exports, which were very convenient for Cuba because they were traded by Cuba with again medical services and teachers and other kinds of in-kind services rather than actually buying them. So it's very hard for Cuba to survive the current situation, and all uh, economic forecasts that I've seen suggest that the situation is not going to improve, but it's actually going to get worse in the short run.
I know the Mexico president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has said she wants to restart shipments to Cuba. So do you think that will happen?
It could happen, at least theoretically. I mean, it's possible within the current constraints of U.S. Uh, policy because President Sheinbaum has announced that it would not be a donation, but rather export through commercial channels uh, to Mexican private business interests in Cuba, which are allowed by the current U.S. Policy, not considered donations by the Mexican government.
Now, I want to talk to you about China a little bit because China is in Cuba. It has set up a number of surveillance centers around the island. But the other thing is that because Cuba does rely on oil, and that is a major factor in their present problems, but China is now building solar parks in Cuba. And they have suggested that within a certain period of time, that they could be totally independent of oil, or at least have oil um, be less of a necessity for the Cuban economy. Number one, how is that working as far as you know? And what is the United States response to that?
Well, I understand that well before the current crisis, the Cuban government had established as a goal precisely to have what they call energy sovereignty, which means basically that because Cuba can only produce about 40% percent of its oil needs domestically, it has been forced to rely again on fossil fuels imported from other countries, uh, primarily Venezuela before January, also the Soviet Union before that. And currently, as you know, the only oil supplies that reach Cuba in the last months was precisely from Russia, and also to a certain extent from Mexico. So Cuba has to look at alternative sources of energy. However, I think it's a little idealistic to expect that Cuba will be able to complete that transformation in the near future, given the cost of these materials, and frankly, because China does not seem poised to replace uh, the former Soviet Union or Venezuela in the past few years as the main um, partner for Cuba's energy ventures. In addition to that, I would also like to mention that the infrastructure for Cuba's energy system, the electricity system, the power grid, has been declining for decades. And part of the problem is that they haven't really invested in maintaining that infrastructure. So well before the current scarcity of oil, the issue was that the system did not work because it was so old and so deteriorated.
A part of that is to go back to the GASA for a minute, that if they indeed do have the $18 billion that they are alleged to have, that could go into the refurbishing of their electrical grid and the like. So, if that's the case, and I know Secretary Rubio has placed sanctions upon GAESA now. So, if they do have that, in your assessment, why haven't they used the money to do that?
Yeah. Well, again, to comment on the situation in Gaza, the best research that I have seen published on that topic has been conducted by Nora Gomez, a journalist at the Miami Herald and the Royal Herald, and she was able to look at some of the uh, counting numbers that were leaked to her directly from Cuba. And whether you agree that it's 40% or not of the entire Cuban economy, there's no question that GAESA is the leading uh, enterprise or conglomerate that's run by the military, and that is very opaque because of the lack of accounting and uh, accountability of that huge system. It runs most of the big hotels in Cuba, gas stations, and many of the commercial ventures, which again was put in place by Raul Castro when he was president in order to run the economy more efficiently. Now, why guys has continued to invest in huge tourist uh, ventures such as uh, luxury hotels, for example, that have been opened in the past few years and seem to be open, empty most of the time, is anybody's guess. It appears to be um, the result of a deliberate decision by GAESA officials that they were expecting a return of tourism to the island once the restrictions by the Trump administration were gone, because they had already experienced that boom during the Obama era, in which a lot of smaller concerns, Airbnbs and private individual businessmen were able to profit from that and take away some of those profits from the state. So that's one explanation that I think is reasonable. But of course, it has led to significant mistakes in planning, and a very difficult situation for most Cuban citizens, and particularly for the private entrepreneurs that now have been basically left out of the picture because of the huge investment by the state on military and industrial activities, and also because, again, of the decline in tourism, especially from the United States.
There is no doubt that the sanctions have had a debilitating effect on the economy on the island of Cuba. And the High Commissioner of Human Rights, Volker Turk, has urged the United States to end the sanctions because he says it is having a deleterious effect on the populations. For example, the cancer survival rate for children has decreased from, I believe, 85% to where it's now 65%. So, and I think you've had a couple of people go down there, I believe in April. The son of the late Jesse Jackson, Jonathan Jackson, and Congresswoman Jayapal went down there. So, do you agree with that? That maybe the sanctions are a little bit too debilitating because it hurts the population?
Well, yes and no. I think that the sanctions have precipitated the humanitarian crisis that Cuba is experiencing now. But it goes, of course, these trends had begun to happen decades ago. Some people would trace it back to the disappearance of the Soviet Union in 1991, when Cuba experienced one of its first economic crisis, the worst economic crisis, so-called special period. And even though it seemed to recover partially, at least in the first few years, it never really took off as a self-sustaining economic development project. Again, because it relied primarily on Venezuelan oil and uh, uh, other sources of income, like I mentioned before, remittances, and particularly the export of medical services. Those factors are no longer in place. And when in January, the Trump administration decided to tighten the screw, so to speak, and to impose the oil embargo, and of course, just this week, there were more sanctions announced against GAESA and particular individuals uh, related to the Castro family in Cuba. Uh, that has only made things worse. So the question whether sanctions themselves are the cost or one of the precipitating factors, I think is debatable. Uh, Clearly, if the sanctions, particularly the oil embargo, were lifted, uh, things would improve in Cuba. But I don't know that it would entirely solve the very difficult internal economic problems that Cuba has had and is only beginning to face. As you know, the recent package of economic reforms that was announced by Miguel Díaz-Canel seem to be the most sweeping reforms in Cuba since the 1960s, but they have come very little and very late in time. And it's difficult to imagine that it could be implemented. There are 176 reforms announced in that package if the United States does not relax its sanctions and does not allow Cuba to trade with other parts of the world and with the United States.
The part of it, I think, with both President Trump and Secretary Rubio is that I believe he gave a video presentation to the Cuban people last month. And one of the things that he has said was that the sanctions are not the cause of the crisis in Cuba. And he's partly right because they've had this problem before. But it would be hard to suggest that the sanctions have not exacerbated the issue. And so, with that, and because I do have to ask the question, do you think he's going to ride this? He's going to try to ride this into the White House in 2028. And I think most people understand that. And so that's the other issue that politics drives this. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about the president's 176 economic reforms, it is what the administration has been asking for to do reform. So, do you think that those 176 reforms can lead to, if not a cessation of the sanctions, but a lessening of them?
Fortunately, it doesn't seem like that. The Department of State has already characterized the reforms, the proposed reforms, as nothing but a smokescreen, and that they're too modest and too late, and that it's just a way of gaining time that the Cuban government has become very adept at in past uh, conflicts with the United States. Uh, so, for example, major reforms like allowing um, different parties in Cuba, political parties to operate, to have free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and to also create a legal framework that is uh, welcoming to foreign investment as well as local private capital and Cubans living abroad so that they can participate in economic recovery. Those things have not happened. And so it looks like from the point of view of the Trump administration, the current restrictions are going to be upheld and perhaps even made worse.
From an intellectual perspective, the United States did not become a liberal democracy overnight. And the idea that I think the ambassador to Cuba, the American ambassador, has said they want a peaceful transition to democracy. Well, America didn't have a peaceful transition to democracy when it was first formed. So, from an intellectual perspective, and you've been studying this for a very long time, how is it possible to have that kind of transition to democracy, a liberal democracy, almost overnight? When I think as we started, Cuba has had a long history of struggling with democracy. They've only had maybe what 15 years of practicing democracy. So how is that possible?
That's a good question. I mean, if you look, for example, at the text of the Helms-Burton Act, which was approved back in the 1990s and codified the embargo, making it impossible for any U.S. president to lift the embargo unless certain conditions are met. Again, some of those conditions are uh, well meant, but for example, free and multiple parties participating in elections, uh, no Castro in power, which technically has happened since the retirement of Raúl Castro, um, and uh, and respect for human rights, the release of political prisoners. All those are sort of uh, goals that could be established in the long run, but it's difficult to imagine that they could be taken by the current government in Cuba in the short run. Some of those things might be possible. For example, releasing political prisoners, which some outside sources estimate may run as high as 1,200 people at the current time. But the Cuban government has so far proven reluctant to do so. And also, it has not made any major political concessions. For example, at one point in the negotiations between Cuba and the U.S., there was talk that the U.S. negotiators were requiring that Miguel Díaz-Canel step down or that Raúl Castro would be exiled to some place in outside of Cuba. And of course, the Cuban government and the leadership of the Communist Party has rallied behind Raúl and Díaz-Canel and does not seem willing to make any concessions in that regard.
I want to draw your attention to a meeting that took place in May of this year with the CIA director, John Ratcliffe. And it struck me as kind of an interesting meeting because it seemed like a don't forget Venezuela kind of thing, where he went down there and he brought with him the person who was responsible for shooting 32 Cubans who were guarding Maduro in Venezuela at the time. And it seemed like a threat that this could happen to you as well. What is your take on that? Because it seems to me that if there really is a desire to get a nation to change, threats are not really the way to go. We've kind of tried that with Iran, and Iran right now is experiencing a rally round the flag scenario. So, what's your take on that meeting without knowing everything that occurred in it?
Yeah, I agree with you. And in fact, that meeting, along with a very short visit by the commander of the U.S. Southern Command to Gitmo, to Guantanamo, a little later on, as well as some of the movements that took place in the past month or so in terms of the nuclear uh, ships that were sent to the Caribbean, the Nimitz in particular,
Hmm.
those are clearly part of the psychological war, if you will, of pressure on Cuba, together with economic coercion, as well as some of the secret, so far, conversations between the U.S. and Cuba, represented by Raúl Castro's grandson, Raúl Rodriguez Castro. So it seems to be part of this broader strategy that the Trump administration is putting in place, and I think you're right. It sort of follows uh, the same pattern. First in Venezuela and later in Iran, and you wonder whether there are any lessons to be learned. Clearly, the Cuban government is following as well the Iranian example and sort of betting that resistance, as they like to call it, is going to be effective, and that it will deter any kind of immediate plans to strike Cuba in ways that would be disastrous, perhaps, for both for the Cuban people as well as the United States forces.
Now, there is no unified opposition force in Cuba right now. I mean, there is opposition, but it's not unified. So, if they were to go in from a military perspective, who would they look to turn the government over to? I mean, is there a Delcy Rodriguez there that we don't know about? Because it seems to me, again, as we said before, you might encounter a rally around the flag reaction. So, what would happen if the United States did that?
I guess anybody's guess from the public statements made by Secretary Rubio and other leaders in the Trump administration, it doesn't appear that they have found an intermediary or somebody that could hold things together once the current government is out of place. Uh, Unlike Maria Corina Machado in Venezuela, who is clearly the dominant opposition figure in Venezuela, in Cuba, as you just suggested, the opposition has been fragmented, has been harassed, persecuted, expelled, even. And in fact, there are many more opposition leaders in exile today, especially in Miami, but also in other places like Spain, than in Cuba itself. And For example, just this week, one well-known figure of the opposition, Manuel Cuesta Morua, was actually arrested, harassed, apparently tortured, and eventually released after a few hours. And so he's one of the possible figures that could lead some sort of transitional government in Cuba. But again, he doesn't have even the name recognition because of the fact that the Cuban government has been so effective in repressing and in uh, harassing and persecuting anyone who really expresses a dissident point of view on the island.
Now, let me ask you kind of a geopolitical question. If the United States decided to invade Cuba, whether it's under the pretext of law enforcement or whatever, and as you said, the like the USS Nimitz is there, and that raises a whole other question. But what do you think how do you think China would react as it pertains to Taiwan? Because Taiwan is about 100 miles off the shore of China, as Cuba is 90 miles off of the United States. What do you think the reaction of China would be?
So far, China and also Russia and even Iran, who have been partners with Cuba for a long time in opposition to the United States, have actually been very timid in their responses to the current crisis. Of course, they have condemned the United States in the United Nations every year, uh, especially regarding the embargo, and have made strong statements about national sovereignty and independence of Cuba, but they have not really, except for that a single Russian oil shipment earlier this year, have not really made any big commitment, particularly military wise. So it seems that China and Russia are adopting a sort of hands-off uh, uh, policy toward Cuba, uh, especially after the so-called the Monroe Doctrine, and now called the
Oh,
Monroe Doctrine, right?
Don
Which
Doctrine.
explicitly, yeah, is explicitly geared toward keeping Russia and China off the
Mhm.
Western Hemisphere as long as uh, the United States keeps its sort of influence in this region. And so to that extent, it seems to be a trade-off, right? And perhaps going back to your question, China might interpret this move, if it happens, by the United States to strike Cuba as as a permission to do a similar thing in regards to Taiwan, just as Russia has been waging a war in Ukraine, and it looks like the Monroe Doctrine doesn't really care that much about the invasion of the Ukraine.
Mhm. Now, in the time that we have left, as you know, Panama has offered to negotiate between the two sides. And you grew up in Panama, you grew up in Cuba. How do you think that would work? I mean, could they play the role that was played in Iran, for example?
Yeah, Panama's an interesting situation, of course, because it's a close ally of the United States and it has the Panama Canal. And because of the long history of the US presence, in fact, Panama was created uh, in a way separating from Colombia by the United States. But there's a very strong anti-American feeling. That's something that I remember clearly from growing up uh, there in the 1960s. So it could be an interesting uh, situation there that could allow from more productive conversations between Cuba and the United States. However, those conversations seem to be going on right now without the intervention of any other uh, entity, including the Vatican. So, but I think in general, the more countries that participate in this, Mexico could be as well another possibility, uh, in order to appease the Trump administration and allow these moderate voices in both parties in the United States and Cuba to conduct more productive negotiations.
Now, with that, you said it could be possible that China would invade Taiwan as they feel that they've been given permission if the United States goes into Havana or into Cuba. But it's always struck me as strange that, Donald Trump was also, allegedly doing illegal things in Cuba back when it was, first made illegal to try to conduct business in Cuba, which is kind of ironic, I would say. But you've grown up, as I said, in Cuba, and you've grown up in Panama. Where do you see this ultimately heading, and how do you think this will end up?
Yeah, unfortunately, now Cuba seems to play a major role in U.S. policy toward Latin America, and I mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. So the sort of the effort to reassert U.S. Influence in the region and not allow any other external actors like Russia and China. So it appears that the focus on Cuba is symbolic in ways that it had not been before the development of this new policy toward Latin America. So, the demonstration effect, perhaps, of uh, reasserting that control and finally expelling any external influence, and particularly the notion that Cuba poses an immediate security threat to the United States, which is very strong in the Trump administration, and most critics have pointed out that Cuba does not have the military capacity it used to have in the 1980s before the decline of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, the current situation seems quite difficult for Cuba, given these threats, these very adverse external conditions, and the willingness of the United States to use military power to conduct its business around the world.
Some have said that the only place where Cuba could be a threat to the United States, and I think it's highly unlikely, is the Strait of Florida, which, in terms of what it is physically, is analogous to the Strait of Hormuz. But that's about the closest you're going to get to that. They do not have the wherewithal to close the Strait of Florida, even though some 60% of American exports in terms of gas and oil goes through the strait. 20% of its other exports goes through that. But Cuba simply does not have the wherewithal. So it's always been confusing to me to try to figure out where would Cuba be a threat to the national security of the United States.
Former commander of the U.S. Southern Command actually recently declared that the main threat that Cuba poses is actually the migration threat, the rise of a new wave of refugees, similar to Mariel in 1980, or the
Mm.
most recent wave with close to 750,000 Cubans who crossed the US-Mexico border. And if the current humanitarian crisis worsens, there could be, again, a new uh, wave of thousands of Cubans trying to reach the United States through the Straits of Florida. And then the response to that situation would probably be centered in Guantanamo Base. And again, the current uh, commander of Gitmo recently declared that they were making plans precisely to receive hundreds and perhaps thousands of would-be Cuban refugees if the situation were to happen.
In the end, are you hopeful about the future of Cuba?
I would like to be. Unfortunately, just yesterday we had a conversation with a number of experts at the University of Miami, precisely, and I think the general consensus is that the situation is not going to improve anytime soon. That the economic, humanitarian uh, situation is going continue to deteriorate unless there's a major change. For example, Raul Castro could die anytime, and perhaps that could lead to a succession crisis, or perhaps uh, one of the top leaders of the Cuban government, like Diaz Canel, could resign, and that again could lead to further changes. But unfortunately, barring those kinds of foreseeable changes, the situation in Cuba will continue to be very difficult for most Cubans living there, and and I think it's likely that the United States will take some sort of military action in the near future.
Dr. Duany, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
And join us again next week as we entertain another issue of global importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.